What's the value of building a personal brand? Is it just kind of an exercise in vanity, of getting lots of likes, of seeing your name in lights, the social media likes? No. I was listening to a podcast the other day where two British guys, James Dooley and Jason Barnard, were talking about personal brand in the context of AEO, GEO. James Dooley was the one who's the owner of the podcast. And Jason Barnard is a world-renowned world authority on AI digital brand intelligence, which is a kind of a fancy way of talking about brand entity optimization. And so James Dooley asked Jason Barnard, what's the value of building a personal brand? And Jason answered, lots of money. So I thought that was really cool because, now you have founder-led marketing and founders wanting to build a personal brand, but, sometimes people think it's a kind of an exercise in just vanity. But Jason Barnard, who is an expert in SEO, AEO, GEO, he was the one that came up with the framework for how to build your Google knowledge panel, Google knowledge graph, etc. He said, building a personal brand is needed in order to make lots of money. And he said that his company, Kalicube, is a database of multiple millions of corporate entities, way more than Wikipedia. He says that 80% of his business that he gets for Kalicube comes from his personal brand, people searching for him and he being recommended by the likes of ChatGPT, Gemini, etc. So I was really heartened to hear this. And I think this is really where things are going for people who want to build personal brands as a way to drive business to their startups, to their B2B companies, whether it's a software company, manufacturing company, services company, consulting company, etc. All right. In this series of interviews between James Dooley and Jason Barnard, they talk about brand entity creation, right? So just a little bit about what an entity is in this brave new world of answer engine optimization and generative engine optimization. I think Jason Barnard is now going in the direction of calling it AI assistive engine optimization and assistive agent optimization. So what he talks about in this brave new world, and one of the key components are what's called entities, right? So your company is an entity as recognized by Google, as recognized by all the LLMs. You as a person, as a founder of a company, as a writer, maybe an author, podcaster, speaker, you are an entity as well. And then you have a whole bunch of other entities, such as your podcast, your book, or various books. Each one of those are entities. And that's the way the search engines, that's the way the AI engines are able to classify things, and because they're associated with words, right? Because you have certain words or certain names, and they could be hundreds of different things, such as the word Nike being the goddess of victory, but then Nike became a sneaker company. And so those are different words, but in order for the AIs and for Google, Bing, et cetera, to give you a significant answer, a result or an answer, it has to recognize what entity is significant to what you're talking about, right? So in order for you to build your personal brand, there is a technical approach to this, right? And this personal brand that you build, there's a technical thing behind it. It can bring you lots of benefits for your business, including making you lots of money. So what are some of the things that Jason Barnard talks about in terms of this brand intelligence methodology, right? So first of all, you got to have the schema markup. So everybody talks about schema markup. This is just a way to classify and identify what are the different entities that you have, such as yourself, your company, and various assets that basically enrich who you are as an entity, right? And so these, schema are things that identify you as a person, as an author, identifies your company, book, etc. And so that's one thing. So you have your website has to be structured properly, and it has to be tagged properly with the right schemas. Then you also have to have what is called your entity home. So your entity home is the single source of the truth for who you are and your company and all the assets that give significance to you as a company, right? So your entity home could be your company website, could be a personal website, but it specifically is a section of your about page, right? So you have the about page, which can be your mission statement, your values, etc. But then there is a part of your web page, of your about page. So think about yourwebsite.com/about is the human readable thing, and then /your name. So companyname.com/about/Fernando-Labastida. That's my entity home. And that's where I am very careful about explaining who I am so that the search engines and so the LLMs can know exactly who I am, right? So it's like you're teaching the bots, you're teaching the LLMs as if they are a junior Salesforce, right? As if they're kids, but they're also a Salesforce. You're teaching them who you are, right? So you say, I'm Fernando Labastida. I am a marketer, and I am the founder of a company called the Viral Genius Institute. And the marketing method that I have is called the Viral Genius Framework. And then immediately you have a link to a page describing the Viral Genius Framework, or in your case, you might have a link to something that describes your methodology or framework. And then you say, I'm the author of 3 books, and then you link to those books, and each one of those pages is a description of your book, because those different books are different entities. And then you go on and on. I've been at these podcasts. You might have a podcast appearance page with links to all the different podcasts. Then if you own a podcast, you have a podcast page with a dedicated page to each podcast episode, even if those episodes live on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, Google Podcasts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is what you have to do. You have to have your own single version of the truth, which is your website and the about/your-name, and then everything that encapsulates who you are, your books, your company, your podcast appearances, your speaker bio with links to the pages where you've spoken. I've spoken at South by Southwest Interactive. I've spoken at CEX and a couple of conferences in Mexico, and then another conference in Chicago. And so I wouldn't necessarily have separate pages for that. That's a little bit too much, but I would have a speaking page with links to all those things, right? Because you might have mentions about who you are everywhere on the web, right? Like I have a page on South by Southwest. I have a page on General Assembly that I'd forgotten about until I Googled myself. I have a page on the CEX website. CEX is a conference called the Content Entrepreneur Expo. I think it's changed. And so then I also have I have my podcast on Spotify and Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, et cetera. So those are separate entities kind of floating around out there, and Google and ChatGPT, whatever, needs to understand that this is part of you. So that's why on your home base, you have links to all those things so that Google can make that connection, right? And so there is what you say about yourself on your home base, on your entity home, as Barnard calls it. And then, but then the search engines and the AIs need corroboration, right? Because they can't just exactly trust that you are the best at what you do, right? I'm the best pastry chef in the world. Says who? So you got to have somebody that verifies that. So then you find all those other places where maybe somebody's mentioning that, maybe you have a page with reviews. Maybe you have a local business and you have a Google business profile and you have a ton of reviews over there. Or maybe somebody, maybe Wall Street Journal has written an article about you. And if you don't, you need to get something like that, right? So what are the different assets that you have? And what are the different assets that you need to create on third-party websites so that it can corroborate, so it can say about you what you say about yourself? So one of the key assets that you can have are books. I have 3 books. One of them is called The Startup Book, has 15 positive, 5-star and 4-star reviews, mostly 5-star. And so I need to have that associated with me. And so what I've just recently done is I created a books page on my website, viralgeniusinstitute.com. You can go to viralgeniusinstitute.com/resources. Let me see if I'm not lying. Yeah, /resources. And then there you have all of the stuff about my books. And then you have the startup book, the Viral Genius Playbook, the Nearshore Marketing. These are the 3 books I've written and published, self-published on Amazon. And I have dedicated pages to each one of those. And then I link to the Amazon sales pages of each one of those. So that way you're communicating to the AIs and also to Google and Bing, et cetera, that the different books that are on different Amazon pages actually have a home and they're associated with you. And there are reviews there that give me credence, right? So books are one entity that give you, that sort of reinforce who you are, that give you that credibility. And there's technical ways of doing that. If you have a podcast, right? You have a podcast and they're all these different platforms. Have a dedicated page for your podcast and then have different pages for each episode of your podcast pointing to the different platforms where they are. In fact, there's James Dooley. I was looking at his website. Well, actually, no, Jason Barnard. He has a podcast. And on his podcast, dedicated podcast episode pages, he has links going to the Apple Podcast version of that episode, the Spotify episode version of the episode, the Amazon version of the episode. He has like about 5 or 7 different, links to the different ones, right? And so what that does is it helps to reinforce. It's part of that kind of difficult sweat equity thing that you have to do to build your personal brand so that the engines can start to recommend you, right? White papers or things other than books that you've written, maybe authoritative ebooks, research reports, all these things that you can do to, maybe you have a research report or a white paper and you have it on a third-party website. Again, you have to have a page on your website pointing to that third party, right? Speaking appearances. This is where, where I have been listed as a speaker on South by Southwest Interactive, on CEX. There was that one that I did in Chicago. I think that was the Niche Media Summit where I was a speaker. I've got to go find those and I've got to list those. And so that way I'm starting to tell the algorithms that, all these different mentions are me are not another Fernando Labastida, that's different from me. These are me. I'm the same Fernando Labastida, right? And then obviously if you have a Google business profile, link to that. And all those reviews can go on your website as well. If you don't have a location-based company or you don't serve a specific geographical area exclusively, then what you probably need to have is a Google Knowledge Panel. That's not something that you can create. That's something that Google will create for you if you do all this work that I'm telling you about. And you should go read Jason Barnard about how to do this. It's a slow, kind of painstaking process, but when you have a Google Knowledge Panel, it's huge. It gives you lots of credibility, but it also, if you do this the right way, it's also a way for you to become this sort of well-known entity out there who will start to be recommended to people when they're looking for your thing, or if they want to find more information about whatever it is that you're talking about, and you've done all this stuff that Barnard tells you to do, right? Guest podcast appearances. Not only do you have to have, not only would you do this with your own podcast, but if you've been a guest on somebody else's podcast and they, on their website and on their podcast descriptions, they say, oh, this was Betty X Davis. It's my grandmother's name. And she talked about how to write stories for little kids. And she uses the POP method, right? The POP method, I'm just making this up, but let's just say that she came up with a framework called the POP method for writing books for little kids. And maybe my grandmother, it was already writing about the POP method on her own website, but it's just her talking about herself. And so she needs third-party corroboration. So the podcast guest will write the description about how she mentioned the POP method for writing children's books. So there you have third-party validation. Then you can possibly do a guest article for another website, maybe an online magazine or Forbes or something. And then the best thing would be is if somebody, this is kind of like the Shangri-La of third-party references, is if somebody kind of independently writes something about you, right? And then also, especially if you're a services company, maybe in the tech space, maybe not necessarily in the tech space, I could do this, I'm going to do this, is you could create your own profile on Crunchbase, right? And then something that Jason Barnard does is he actually has created a profile in IMDb. And I thought that was crazy because I thought that was only, reserved for people in the movie industry, producers, directors, actors, etc. But he has one. And I think the qualification, I asked ChatGPT, what's the qualification for opening up a profile on IMDb? And I think you got to be a producer, creator of some kind of a media asset, such as a podcast or a YouTube channel or something. I'll have to see if that's still, if they haven't made the criteria stricter, etc. Those are some of the things, but the most valuable one is if somebody independently writes an article about you on the Wall Street Journal or in the Atlanta Free Press, the Austin American Statesman, etc. Okay, this is all well and good, but you also need to own a distinct or unique position, right? So in one of the podcast episodes I was listening to, Jason Barnard was talking about how he it was part of his company Kalicube. They do regular thousands and thousands of queries of the different LLMs with clean slates. In other words, they haven't been contaminated by the regular use of ChatGPT or Claude, etc., like you and I do. If we've been using ChatGPT for any amount of time, it already knows us. And so if you ask it to tell me about Annette Benning, and you are Annette Benning, right? So suppose you're Annette Benning and you ask, it'll just tell you everything that you've already been talking to it. So you have to have a clean slate. You have to have a access to an LLM that doesn't know you from Adam and see what it has in its training data and what it's able to find on the web about you. He said that when he asks 10 different questions, who is the best AEO, GEO thought leader? Who is the most well-known thought leader when it comes to SERPs, the search engine results pages? Who is the best, most well-known thought leader that talks about, Google knowledge panels, etc. 10 different queries. He came up as the number one person in those areas, right? So he owns that space. He owns that space. And so if somebody else wants to own that space and do everything that he did, such as creating their entity home, doing the schema markup, creating the descriptions for what their entity is, their personal brand entity, their company entity, their books, etc., their podcasts, etc., they would not be able to dislodge him from that location. So you have to have something distinctive where there's no competition. And I'm doing that right now for Viral Genius Framework, which is upstream from what Barnard is talking about, which is getting that distinctive point of view from what you already have inside of you that you haven't recognized yet or verbalized openly yet. And that is the key, right? So, and this is something that Barnard, I don't think he has been talking extensively about it. This is what I'm talking about. I love Barnard's methodology. I'm going to apply it, and I recommend each one of you all apply this. But part of what is the missing piece here is that excavation of your zone of genius, that excavation of your one unforgettable idea that can become your category or your new standard for how to do things. Think clean bathrooms versus all the other gas stations out there that have filthy bathrooms, or just a different culture or vibe. If you're somebody like a real estate agent or consultant, where it's a very commoditized market, but you want to distinguish yourself by having a different type of culture or persona, etc. Those are 3 different ways of applying the one unforgettable idea. But have that one unforgettable idea, excavate it from yourself or get a third party to excavate it. I do that for a living. And then start building out your brand entity, your personal brand. Barnard, this is very important. Barnard says you can do your personal brand entity and your company brand entity, but it's quicker and easier to build your personal brand entity, which then gets taken to your company brand by default, and you can start to build on top of that. But build your personal brand entity. This might take, sometime. Barnard says that it took him 13 years to get to where he is today. But I know if you get started right now, within a year, you're going to have, maybe or less, you're going to have a Google Knowledge graph, or Google Knowledge panel, and you will start to be recommended, right, for something that only you can be the leader of in your industry, that maybe a new category that you created. That's it for today, and I'll see you next week.